Hello and welcome to Track Changes. I'm Murray Griffin, and in this episode we're going to hear from one of Australia's top climate and economic policy experts, Barry Sterland. Barry is now a commissioner with the federal government's main independent advisory body on economic, social and environmental issues, which is known as the Productivity Commission. Last December, Australia's Treasurer Jim Chalmers instructed the Productivity Commission to conduct 5 inquiries, all of which are focused on delivering productivity growth. One of those 5 inquiries is focused on clean energy and the net zero transformation, while another is focused on tax and regulatory reform. Some people might find it frustrating or even annoying that climate change policy is being considered through a productivity lens. After all, as the Treasurer has put it, productivity is often seen as a cold, almost soulless concept. But in reality, productivity is about lifting living standards, especially for working people. And it's about living up to our obligations to future generations in order to deliver them a better standard of living. And that's also what the race to net zero is pretty much about. Trying to avoid the destruction of living standards and living up to our obligations to future generations, as well as our obligations to nature. This chat with Barry Sterland is focused on the Commission's brand new interim report on clean energy and the net zero transformation, which makes recommendations on key issues including the electricity sector, large emitters, environmental approvals, transport and housing. And it also touches on another new Productivity Commission report that Barry has co-authored, namely its report on tax and regulatory reform. There's some big ideas in these 2 reports, both of which Barry has co-authored, but let's face it, we've got some big problems to fix, so we need some big ideas. So let's hear what Barry has got to say. Hello, Barry, and welcome to Track Changes.
Well, thanks so much, Murray. Good to talk to you again.
Now, you've been a very productive Productivity Commissioner over the past week because there's not 1 but 2 major interim reports that have been issued by the Commission over the past few days that carry your name as one of the co-authors. You must be pleased to see them both out the door and open to public comment.
Absolutely. Part of the Productivity Commission model is to test those ideas, their interim reports, and then we formulate the final later in the year. We took a lot of feedback as we thought about it, and then put some of our own analysis together. And it's been really good to work across different dimensions of the productivity challenge. You sort of see linkages between them, and it's also really important to, given the challenge Australia faces, to sort of operate on that broad front. So that's really emphasised it for me to have to have the different headspace and really think about the issues separately and then together, if you like.
Yep, absolutely. I do want to look at your interim tax and regulation report a bit later on, but let's start with your interim clean energy and net zero report. Can I ask you first up, how is the lens that the Productivity Commission is applying to climate change and clean energy in this review? How is it different to the work that occurs through other review bodies, such as the Climate Change Authority? And how is it different to other reviews that have occurred in the past?
Well, we hope it's really complementary to those other bodies. We all have different mandates that, somewhat overlap, and I wouldn't want to overstate the differences. The Climate Change Authority, certainly looks at things from a economic angle as part of their outlook, and the PC's always had ESG and environmental issues in its mandate. So
yep.
There's similarities, but the difference, I think, is the issue that we probably bring to it is we're doing it as part of a broader set of productivity reviews. So we're looking at this issue of the really important issues of climate and energy alongside other issues in the economy. And I don't think there's many institutions that do that. So it's thinking about the broad sweep of policies that affect productivity growth and Australians' well-being, and that the challenge of thinking about it from different issues, and the commission process brings that together. Obviously, these are all released, in a sense collectively, and we all have input to the reviews. it brings up a few different angles, a few different themes than perhaps within the particular area of climate and energy would.
Before we get into the actual findings and recommendations of that interim report, I wanted to ask you about the submissions you received to this inquiry, because you've run consultations on various aspects of climate policy over quite a few years. And I was wondering whether there were any interesting trends or shifts that you observed in submissions that you received this time around, which you think probably wouldn't have been made in submissions to a similar inquiry held, I don't know, say 5 years ago.
I think the biggest change is sort of the sense that it's part of the landscape now. There's not a lot of pushback to the sense that this is part of a productivity story. I don't think you would have had that strong perspective 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago.
Yeah.
The trend started then, and Australia has had a long tradition of integrating these issues, as you know, with our broader economic sort of frameworks. But I think the sort of natural fit of it is the thing that I'd sort of point to, the sense that it got over a quarter of the responses to the productivity pitch that we put out early in the year. Quite a high proportion of those were climate and energy, and that's with something that didn't have a climate and energy label. So that suggests to me that sort of evolution and the sort of thinking about this as a central part of Australia's economic challenge and productivity challenges are more mainstream now than it once was.
Yeah, which that's certainly a big relief. Let's talk about your findings and recommendations in the report. You said in the media release that came out with the report that Australia's net zero transformation is well underway. Getting the rest of the way at the lowest possible cost is central to our productivity challenge. Do you think the importance of keeping costs as low as possible as we make this massive transition, do you think that's sometimes overlooked or sometimes isn't properly considered in policy decision making?
It's sort of yes and no. In a sense, there's been a tendency to only talk about cost. In some stages of this debate. And I think the thing that's really changed that has been the really rapid transformation in the costs of some key technologies. Renewable energy, EVs. When you and I were talking a while back, there wasn't really part of the picture. There was, it was really costly to contemplate some of these technologies. So that's one big change. And so in one sense, that's a welcome development. There's a lot of things that are possible now that were much harder and would have required much bigger levers to push, right, once upon a time, more costly changes. But then that can sometimes, the flip side of that is that getting to the really deep emissions reductions over time inevitably does involve some costs, some very significant costs. And when we put that together, the reducing emissions part with also the adaptation part, there's some really big challenges there for the economy. So sometimes there can be a sort of a sense, I think, that it's a bit inappropriate to talk about costs with such an important issue, right? It can look like it's a sort of narrow focus when the issue is so massive. I'd flip that around and say if we're going to deal with this successfully, we really need to focus on doing it at least cost so that we can achieve the change needed while achieving all the other things that matter for us as a community. Yeah. It matters for the very specific communities and stakeholders that get impacted by some of the measures. The whole issue of ensuring a good transition and people and communities and people prosper in that. So I really think there's a real responsibility to actually think about cost and least cost options and constantly refining our response so that it does achieve that and achieves the climate goals fundamentally.
Yeah, I think that's really true, that some people think, if you focus in on cost, you sort of that's not really appropriate. We just need to do whatever it takes. And of course, we need to do whatever it takes. But if you spend more money than you need to, as you say, those other things that we demand and deservedly demand as a society can go unfunded, which can create real problems. There are a lot of draft recommendations in the report, but when you reflect on them, which ones do you think are most central to the task of keeping costs low and speeding up the transition?
Look, I think there's a general approach in there of consistent early signalling. That doesn't appear in a specific recommendation, but I think if you take it together, that sense of acting early and with consistency really matters in that cost equation. It sends the right signals for action. This is true of reducing emissions. It's true of building out infrastructure. It's true of adaptation. So that's a sort of a thematic, I think.
Yeah.
Choose your the right levers and focus on them and get them right. And so that sort of efficiency of thinking about the problem you're solving and then choosing the right solution. So they're the sort of going in points. I think in terms of reducing costs, I would think the most immediate issues to resolve are going to be to get an enduring market based solution into the energy electricity market.
Yeah.
The measures we have, they're going to be in some ways operative after 2030, but they won't be giving new signals. And so that exercise matters. There's a review going on, as you know, in the national electricity market at the moment.
Yeah.
So coming out of that process with some good outcomes will be really critical, given how central electricity is to the successful transition. So I think that would be very high on our priority list. It's why we mention it first.
Yeah.
In a sense, it becomes a bit of a spine against which some of the other decarbonisation activities in the economy interact with. And I think the systems around our energy infrastructure build are the other really immediate thing that need to be, those recommendations to get that moving more quickly. We're not the first people to say that. We just want to put that in the whole of economy framework as a really high priority. It's about emissions, as you know, but it's also about energy as a essential service and for the economy and for individuals and consumers. So finding ways to get to reduce the cost of that, for assessment processes to be more efficient, that's a really high priority, I would say.
Yeah. As you say, you're not the first to talk about assessment and approvals, but you do have some novel ideas there. So I'll come to those in a minute. But you talking of electricity, you did mention the Nelson Review of the NEM. In your interim report, you basically stick to some high-level principles for what needs to happen with electricity because of that Nelson Review. But I think it's correct that both your report, the final report of the Productivity Commission, and the final report of the Nelson Review are basically due to hit the decks at about the same time, which is in December this year. And I presume that means there's going to be a lot of high-level engagement between the two reviews ahead of both reports being put to government. Is that the case?
Yeah, we'll keep consulting. We'll do that in a number of ways. Like we put a submission into that review the first stage. When the interim report from that comes out, we want to observe where that has landed, how it matches against our principles. We'd want to look at that carefully. There's a sort of sense that there's some issues that may be, more in scope within that review, and there's other issues that aren't as in scope. So we'll want to make sure when we see where those draft recommendations or how they're pitched come out, how they interact with the principles we're taking into it, and then try and we'll shape our response.
Yeah. fair enough.
But I think you're right. Your basic premise that there's a chance for us to both put our draft reports out, our interim reports, and then reflect and see which issues remain to be resolved to ensure that really critical priority gets properly addressed.
Yep. Okay. Let's move on to the safeguard mechanism, which applies to very large emitters. And you make some interesting suggestions there I'd like to go into. You strongly suggest dropping the safeguard threshold so that it covers all facilities that emit at least 25,000 tonnes of greenhouse gas annually, not just those that emit at least 100,000 tonnes annually. I know that there's going to be quite a few people and organisations that would agree with that proposal. But I guess I was wondering, I actually have a few doubts about it because it seems to me it would be far better to manage those mid-tier emitters through state EPA licensing regimes. And that's because, state EPAs are better at doing a sort of carrot and stick approach that mid-tier emitters often need. And the safeguard is not really a policy for the faint-hearted. It's quite a complex policy for participants to navigate in an optimum way that also has emissions reductions integrity. So I wonder, could you tell me your thoughts on that option? Could regulation via state EPAs be an alternative to safeguard expansion, or would that be introducing complex state-based regulation of the kind that is kind of anathema to you?
I think there can be roles for policies to be complementary there.
Yeah.
I suppose we'd say that some of the heavy complexity involves measurement, and so some of it there's two aspects to that compliance. As you know, there's the measurement infrastructure around greenhouse and energy reporting, as well as then the interaction with benchmarks and the credits and that sort of structure.
Yeah.
We think because the first one's already covered to a large extent, it's not like all the elements of compliance are being dealt with at once. There's, and we're going to be doing some more analysis of this. But there are a tractable number of entities. We want to explore the different parts of the abatement story that those entities have access to. Our going in hypothesis is that there might be some elements that are quite amenable to the sort of market responses that the safeguard mechanism encourages, and we're not overly prescriptive about the when and the how. We are aware there's a review coming up that should look at the issues of compliance carefully, which is, I think, a little bit behind your question. It's about transaction costs and the like.
Yes.
And look at market arrangements and that sort of thing. So we know that already some industries are somewhat bisected by the safeguard mechanism around the 100,000 threshold that was highlighted in the review of the carbon leakage review. So you've got to look at those issues very carefully. But we think because we have a functioning mechanism here, it would be the first thing I would want to look at would be expanding that to increase its efficiency and breadth. That would have overall beneficial aspects of being able to deal with emissions. The benefit of the safeguard mechanism is it's essentially a market-based mechanism that brings many of the characteristics that many have been looking for some time. And
absolutely.
We think if it's possible to expand that, it's something to be looked at very carefully.
Yeah, okay. Moving on to clean energy approval processes, which you mentioned earlier, and in particular the EPBC regime. Your report makes a number of recommendations and suggestions. You call for the introduction of national environmental standards, regional planning, greater access to high-quality information, and clear expectations about engagement with local communities and First Nations people. I guess I'm keen to focus on a couple of other suggestions you make, though. Firstly, the establishment of a clean energy coordinator general and what you call a specialist strike team within the department to facilitate the assessment of major clean energy projects. Why are they important changes to make?
Well, yeah, so you're right. It's in some ways the first part about the changes to the BBC are, lots of people have advocated that, the Samuel Review onwards.
Yeah.
And really we just wanted to say, sometimes it's important just to say that, right? There's some reforms sitting there. And so perhaps that's why you moved to the more, the newer aspects. And that was
Yes.
really to get at the fact that the legislative change, even, given the focus we're seeing, we're already seeing that in the government to progress that. It'll take time inevitably. The drafting, these are complex changes, even if you know where you're heading. And there's a time dimension that really gives this urgency. Now, the strike team, there's already the government provided resourcing to assist with the priority projects in a recent budget, where reflecting the fact that stakeholders were telling us some of the issues were still there, that the issue of, this is no comment on the teams involved, that there's sort of about energy expertise, the network natures of energy assets require some sort of both a capability focus and an enhanced focus in terms of a specialised focus in terms of resources. We just wanted to reflect that because we thought it really important to ensure that both the environmental approvals and the energy nature of those approvals was brought together in a way. So that was, it's within the current structure, but we thought it was important to call out what we were hearing from stakeholders in the lead up to that. And then on the Coordinator General front, we're aware that sometimes regulatory regimes can interact in a way that can be hard for individual portfolios to manage. We have Commonwealth state issues that can come up.
Yeah.
We're proposing the Coordinator General be at the Commonwealth level, and we sort of suggest that a central agency might be the best place to help resolve these blockages, but that one of the roles of that would be to report on progress of the key energy transition projects, and also have a focus that keeps working at blockages where there might be a Commonwealth state angle. Obviously, that would require cooperation, but having a focus, a national focus on ensuring this was progressing at an administrative and a sort of a whole of government level, we thought was important. And so they're administrative responses, but we just felt that given the urgency involved of replacing our energy assets for reliability and also the emissions reduction task, that it was really a pull out all stops type situation.
Yeah. And I think Queensland's had a Coordinator General role for quite some time, like with a broader remit. But I mean, there is precedent, I guess, for this kind of thing.
Yeah, and some of the other states have considered it, and I think implementing them.
Yeah.
And we just call out that there's some other functions that have similar, there's the front door function that's being set up. And so we just want to be, while that's all happening, we didn't want to be too determinative about how we recommended that, but we just thought it was an important enough issue to draw attention to. And we've had these roles at various times at the Commonwealth before. The global financial crisis response, for example, had someone in that role. So they were two suggestions to push things along.
Yeah. Okay. And sticking with the EPBC Act, another thing that you suggest is that the Act be amended to require the Minister to consider the needs of the energy transition when deciding whether to approve an energy project. But you also say this is not about that amendment would not be about changing the existing national interest test in the EPBC Act. So I guess I'm I'd be keen for you to clarify how you think that new provision in the Act would work and what it would actually do in practice.
So there's already provision, as you know, for the minister, provision and requirement to consider economic and social considerations. In a sense, this is a subset or it's a focused version of that, but it's calling out an issue that's really critical and focusing attention on that. And we talked about the emissions element of that, the essential service nature of the energy transition. We have to replace the exiting capacity in a timeline. And so we felt that within the framework of the Act that this was a way that could draw attention to that. Now, that would be incorporated in the same way as it can be now, but with a particular focus on impacts on the energy transition. So, I'll let the lawyers be really specific about how this comes into a consideration, but obviously it will affect how, once you've got to be assured that you're addressing it to the substantial extent, the matter of national environmental significance that are in question. And this would be another element to think of as you developed for example, management plans or other factors around that approval. You'd be considering this quite specifically. So it would enable and give the minister some focus in that consideration.
Okay, well, let's talk about Australian carbon credit units, or ACCUs as they're known. You say in the report that maintaining access to high integrity ACCUs will be critical. Now, I'm a big fan of ACCUs as long as there's always a strong focus on ensuring integrity, and that seems to be your view as well. You say in the report that governments should seek to integrate ACCUs into every national emissions reduction policy over time so that hard-to-abate emitters face consistent incentives. And you talk in the report about the potential for ACCUs to deliver economy-wide benefits. Could you expand on those points? And do you think the benefits of ACCUs get enough recognition? And do you think we're doing enough to actually make sure those potential benefits are maximised?
Yeah, the reforms that have been announced and are in process, we're calling those out as being really important. Lots of reviews in recent years, as you know, and we're not seeking to add to that. So dealing with any issues in the ACCU system, as you know, we say briefly on the way in the safeguards section that our preference would be to keep the same open approach to the use of ACCUs in the safeguard facilities. We always want to deal with issues to do with ACCUs, if there are any, are best dealt with in that ACCU framework primarily, and then not a second time. And so we have no reason to question or doubt the direction of those reforms, and they're playing out, and there's a very comprehensive roadmap. Then we get to the end of the report. The bit that you're calling out is that I suppose you step back. The approach we're taking to this report is to sort of take the sectoral measures that they've been important expansions in the last few years that have introduced market elements, broad-based elements. We've talked a lot about the safeguard, its advantages. There's sort of elements in the new vehicle emission standards that have market elements which are really welcome. We'll see what comes out of the Nelson Review and associated thinking. That's been really important. It sort of has broadened the net. It allows you to have all the desirable things that can reduce the cost of reducing emissions over time. There's a certain point in each of those sectoral measures where we come up against harder emissions to abate, and it happens at various stages, as you know, and that'll be clearer in the sectoral plans. But it does happen. And there'll be a point where, in a sense, we have to think about how those more difficult to abate problems are solved in a consistent way. And so the sectoral approach we have, we think, has been an advance, and the general tenor of the report is to expand, fill in gaps, and reduce duplication.
Yeah.
But there'll be a point in the future where we have to think about how you get and efficiently trade off the really hard to abate parts of the economy. And we think that ACCUs or something similar, there might be evolution over time, but efficient ways of accessing, removals, and there probably will be removals at that point, can be then employed. Now, then you start linking. There will be issues of how the sectors run together, and that's why we emphasise the importance of the sectoral measures sort of working a little bit in concert or trending together over time, so that you're not, with one measure working one sector, particularly hard and the other one's not. I think there's that sort of sense of consistency, and part of it so that when you get to those harder decisions, you're starting from a similar place as you can. And that'll be important for market development, but also just efficiency and cost at that point.
It's always surprised me, I guess, that ACCUs have this role working, allowing sectors to I guess work in tandem in a way, but we don't actually have a carbon market industry roadmap or anything like that to kind of work out or give people guidance on how it's all going to unfold. And sort of coming back to your original point that people need, clear signals delivered well in advance, it does seem a bit like the ACCU market is kind of is missing out in that regard. Going back to the crucial issue of keeping costs low, you talk about the need for governments to improve transparency on the costs and benefits of policy measures. And you say one way this could be done is through the use of independently developed national target consistent carbon values, which could then be used to assess the cost effectiveness of proposed policies. I hadn't heard that term before, that term national carbon values. Can you talk about what they are and what they do?
It's related to the concept of, social cost of carbon estimates, and it's different in that it is sort of just tracing that through for Australian whatever's determined as part of our nationally determined contribution. So it's similar in concept to the concept you probably are very well aware of. And it's been target consistent carbon values have been developed by several different institutions. And so they've grown up in a sort of fairly, not random's the wrong word, because they've grown up as different institutions have had need for them. So institutions which have taken the challenge of climate change seriously have understood that if they're doing a cost benefit of a regulation or a piece of infrastructure, they need some sense of how to value the carbon benefits coming from that, and that there's sort of a sense that you can do that in a variety of ways, and there's been different methodologies in the past, but the one that seems to have gathered a bit of attention in several different institutions have been some sense of what would get you to the emissions sort of targets that you've said you've committed to in some way. So we've just seen that they're occurring. There's different ones, and at the Commonwealth level, as we get serious, we've really improved our framework. There's a wider variety of measures, but there's also a need to start how do you think of making these measures fit within a broader frame, and how do you value the carbon benefits from that? How do you calibrate the costs of a measure like that? Because they're really sort of costing the externality in some way. And so should be brought into cost benefit analysis. And when we've looked out, we're finding measures using different measures. And, as a country that's making its way towards those medium-term and then long-term targets, having some consistency in this was our suggestion. So it's not new in the sense that a lot of people are already doing that. It's being increasingly used in analysis. This was about consistency. And then that's how we use it, how we suggest it's used is perhaps a bit new in the sense of using it to then try and, bring consistency in these policies over time.
Yep. Okay. One other recommendation you make is for the development of a nationally consistent climate resilience star rating system for housing. It does seem like resilience generally has been the sort of undercooked part of climate policy for a very long time. How do you think a scheme like that would affect decisions about what sort of housing is built, where it's built, and how do you think it would affect the decisions that home buyers might make?
The issue we thought when we looked at housing in particular, it's a massive asset, obviously. The built environment at the local level matters enormously for productivity just because of the scale of investment. But it also matters and is quite difficult because it's really distributed investment. There's other parts of the economy where you expect decision makers to be much more aware in a sort of natural sense. The critical infrastructure and government investment in infrastructure is acutely aware of climate risks when they're making those big decisions, but millions of households have less capability. They do it less often. So we thought the place to start in that, it's not the place to end, but the place to start is getting more information to households so that when they do things like major upgrades to their home or have the opportunity to think about renovations, for example, that getting that as early as possible so that you can make it, that's again part of the low cost. Retrofitting is expensive. If you pick the right parts of any capital cycle, it becomes less expensive. Having clear information, some sort of system that can send clear signals to householders who are able to make those investments will matter. And then, of course, governments will have to think about the households that are less able to do that. And so we just thought getting some basic information here was really important because we just didn't think there were really incipient efforts to sort of start this off, but we think it's got to become part of our whole thinking as a community. And if we don't do it in that early signaled and the lowest cost way, it's just going to, the cost of fixing up disasters and the like, and just the cost to well-being, the cost to productivity and work and the economy and all these things are just going to escalate. So getting some basic information on the table so that we can start making those decisions as a community and it can't all be back to government, and then thinking about how you do that in a strategic sense later. But we thought there were some early steps to start filling in gaps here, and that was the rationale for recommending that. And there's some early efforts happening, as you might be aware.
I'm not aware of them, but I think it's a great recommendation, and I like it partly because one point that you make in your report, which is that it would enable households to potentially pay cheaper insurance premiums if they invest in resilience measures. I think that would be great to see.
Well, some of the early efforts have tried to use that as the metric for for identifying the stars. It's what asset loss is this likely to, on average, reduce. If you can get that developed more, it's got to be really done in concert with industry, and I think some of the early efforts have been. So we thought that was an important idea, and it adds to the business case, and that's one of the reasons you might motivate investment. And we're not saying that's the end of the story because it's probably an imperfect measure, and there'll be all sorts of other barriers that no doubt the adaptation plan will look at. The recent CCA report, I think, identified many of those, but we just thought it was important to get some practical steps out on the table in this one.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, speaking of homes, we're on the home stretch now, Barry, and I'd like to ask you a question or two about your other report, which focuses on reforming company tax and reducing the thicket of rules and regulations with the aim of boosting productivity and encouraging business dynamism. Could I ask you, would acting on the recommendations that you make in the tax and regulation report, would they have benefits in terms of delivering a fast, low-cost transition to net zero?
I think they would. The measures that we're talking about would, we think, increase investment across the economy considerably, and capital intensive investment would be one of the type we're talking about, would be one of the types of industries that you would expect that combination. And it's just for the people who aren't following this, we're proposing a sort of rebalancing of the corporate tax system between the current corporate income tax and a new cash flow tax at a reasonably low rate. And the combination of those two things increases the incentive at the margin to invest. So, we think there's, when we think about all across the 5 pillars, there'll be advantages that go between them as measures. You can see some of those interactions. The regulatory side of that, we're just wanting to call attention to the fact that it's really important to regulate efficiently. You've got to pick the outcomes you're wanting to secure and get there in as efficient way as possible. And when we looked at that, there were many examples where it wasn't a trade-off between growth and the harm that was being regulated. Both were being addressed very well. I mean, think about the EPBC discussion we had earlier, where there's dissatisfaction about the environmental outcomes and the approvals. Like, it's not like it's everyone's happy with one and just worried about the cost to the other. So that gets repeated right through the economy. And in the area of climate and energy, that just means really being careful and conscious about the growth impacts of new regulatory measures. Have we dealt with a problem substantively through another measure? Do we have to deal with it twice or 3 times? E.g., if we deal primarily, the ACCU discussion was a good one, but if you're dealing primarily with an issue with a well-targeted policy, do you need to regulate again for it with another policy? Put conditions around project approvals or grants or whatever when you've got a primary policy that's doing a good job. So I think they're the issues we've got to really think about in the climate and energy space that would be relevant to that discussion.
Yeah. Okay. Finally, Barry, one last question, which I ask everyone I chat with on the podcast. What fact do you wish was more widely known because it would help us to move faster to a cleaner, greener, better world?
I think it's the issue that we have to go ahead with the energy transition regardless. Like there's just the existing assets are coming to the end of their technical lives. And so there's sort of there can be an artificial binary that there's a climate group and then there's a different group. There is just a need to have an energy transition, and if we're doing that, then it makes sense to look at the lowest cost ways of achieving that and future proofing it and resolving some of the other really critical issues we face. The climate being primary in that. So it sort of makes sense, obviously, to do that. But if the fact of just understanding that change is needed and very large change is needed under any scenario, like there's no, like that, understanding that fact more widely then changes the framing of the next things you have to resolve.
That's a great answer. A very good answer. Thanks so much, Barry. And thanks so much for the chat.
I really enjoyed it. Thanks very much for asking, Murray. It's been a great to chat to you.
I hope you enjoyed that chat with Barry Sterland. If you did, please rate the episode on your favourite podcast platform and share it with colleagues who might be interested. As always, if you want to get in touch with me, you can reach me on murray@earthed.au. That's Murray, MURRAY, at earthed, EARTHED.au. See you next time.